Imagine waking up to the sound of bulldozers outside your home, only to realize they're not working on a construction site. They're here for your house. That's right. The Homeowners Association, the same HOA that promised to protect property values and make the neighborhood better, had made up their minds. They wanted my house gone. But let me tell you this, they messed with the wrong person. Because by the time I was done with them, their office was the one that disappeared. I live in a suburban neighborhood where every single lawn looks almost identical, like they were cloned from one another. Perfectly cut grass, trimmed to the exact same length. Mailboxes lined up neatly in a row, all freshly painted in the same dull beige color the HOA approved years ago. Sidewalks so spotless, you'd think people scrubbed them with toothbrushes every morning. That's the HOA's pride, creating what they call uniformity and perfection. To outsiders, it probably looks impressive, like one of those neighborhoods you see in real estate magazines. But to people who actually live here, that uniformity comes at a heavy price. At first, I didn't mind it. Honestly, I even thought it was nice. Who doesn't want to live somewhere clean, peaceful, and safe-looking? A place where every house looks tidy, every hedge is trimmed, and no one leaves broken cars on the street? It seemed like the perfect neighborhood to settle down in. But as time went on, I started to notice something strange. The HOA wasn't acting like a friendly community organization. They weren't here to help us or support us. They were running the place more like a mini dictatorship, complete with rules, punishments, and people spying on you just to report the smallest thing. It began with small, almost laughable rules. For example, my neighbor once got fined because his trash can stayed at the curb for an extra 12 hours after pickup. He worked late that day, came home tired, forgot to bring it in, and boom, $50 fine in his mailbox. Another family was forced to replace all their window curtains because the shade of white they used wasn't the right shade, approved by the HOA board. Can you imagine that? Getting punished because your curtains weren't white enough. And it didn't stop there. A sweet older couple down the street planted a row of bright tulips in their front yard. They looked beautiful, colorful, lively, and they brought a little joy to an otherwise boring street. But within a week, the HOA slapped them with a violation notice. Why? Because tulips weren't on the approved flower list. Yes, you heard me right. They actually had a list of approved plants for the neighborhood. Anything else was considered non-compliant. The couple had to dig up their flowers and replace them with boring shrubs, or else face daily fines. It was like living in some twisted version of the Truman Show, where every detail of your life had to be scripted and approved. At first, I tried to ignore it. I figured, hey, that's just how HOAs are. Don't make waves and you'll be fine. So when little fines came my way, I paid them without much fight. Once, they fined me for leaving a ladder leaning against the side of my garage overnight. Another time, they sent me a warning because I had left my porch light bulb burned out for 3 days before replacing it. Annoying? Yes. Worth fighting over? Probably not. So I kept my head down, played by their rules as much as I could, and avoided confrontation. But here's the thing about bullies. When you don't push back, they only get bolder. And the HOA wasn't any different. They had this hunger for control, and once they saw people were too scared or too tired to fight back, they kept tightening their grip. It wasn't just about lawns and mailboxes anymore. It was about control, pure and simple. You could feel it in the air. Neighbors whispered about their fines and complaints, but no one dared to stand up. People started walking on eggshells in their own homes, terrified that some board member would drive by and spot a violation. I remember one Saturday morning, I was out front washing my car. A board member actually slowed down in his SUV, rolled down the window, and stared at me like he was making sure I wasn't breaking any rule. That's the kind of paranoia this place created. You couldn't even relax in your own driveway without wondering if someone was watching. And yet, I still told myself, stay out of trouble. Don't draw attention. Just blend in. But one day, everything changed. I'll never forget that moment. I came home from work and found a thick envelope taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was just another minor violation notice. Maybe they didn't like the way my grass was cut, or maybe my car had been parked too close to the curb. But when I opened it, My heart dropped. This wasn't a simple fine. This wasn't a warning. It was something far, far worse. The letter said my house, yes, my entire home, was non-compliant with HOA standards. And unless I took corrective action, they were planning to schedule demolition. I actually read the letter 3 times, because I thought I misunderstood. Demolition? As in bulldozers tearing down my house? At first I laughed. It sounded too ridiculous to be real. But the more I read, the clearer it became. They weren't joking. They had actually decided that my home, the place I had worked for years to pay off, didn't fit their vision for the neighborhood. And because of that, they wanted it gone. That was the day everything changed. I had kept my head down for years. I had paid their stupid fines. I had followed their ridiculous rules. But threatening to destroy my home? That crossed the line. The HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. While the rest of the neighborhood looked like it had been stamped out of the same plastic mold, my home carried a story in every brick, every plank, and every corner. It was older, built long before the HOA even existed. The walls were thicker, the roof had a steeper pitch, and the wood had that timeless look that spoke of real craftsmanship, not mass production. Out front, there was a big oak tree that had been standing for generations, its branches spreading wide like a giant umbrella, giving shade in the summer and a home for birds year-round. Kids would often stop by on their way home from school just to climb it, laughing and dangling their legs as they balanced on the sturdy branches. That oak wasn't just a tree. It was part of the neighborhood's history. And then there was the porch swing. Hand-carved wood, slightly creaky, but still strong, swaying with the wind. On summer evenings, I'd sit there with a glass of iced tea, listening to the cicadas sing and watching the sun sink low over the perfectly manicured lawns of my neighbors. It wasn't just furniture. It was a piece of soul, something warm and real in a neighborhood that felt increasingly sterile. That's exactly why the HOA hated it. They didn't see charm. They didn't see history. All they saw was something that didn't match. In their eyes, my home was an eyesore, a blemish on their perfect little postcard neighborhood. The first time they brought it up, I laughed. I honestly thought it was a joke. They sent me a notice claiming my property failed to align with community standards. Apparently, my oak tree made the street look uneven. My porch swing, according to them, looked outdated. And the color of my shutters? Not consistent with neighborhood values. Neighborhood values. Can you believe that? As if the shade of paint on my shutters somehow threatened the morality of the entire community. But when I laughed, they didn't. The HOA members stared back at me with their straight faces, their clipboards in hand, their arms crossed like judges at a trial. That's when I realized they weren't joking. They actually believed my home, one house, on one street, was dragging down the value of hundreds of others, as if buyers driving through the neighborhood would stop and say, "Oh no, I saw one wooden porch swing. I'm shaving $50,000 off my offer." It was ridiculous. And yet, the more I ignored their complaints, the harder they pushed. At first, it was letters. Then it turned into threats of fines. Then it escalated into personal visits. I'd see board members walking by my property, pointing at things, snapping pictures like they were crime scene investigators. And then came the letter, the one that froze me in place. It was a bright morning, sun shining, birds chirping, when I found it taped to my door. A thick envelope, heavier than usual, with bold red letters splashed across the top. Notice of demolition, non-compliant property. For a few seconds, I couldn't even process it. I thought maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe the kids down the street had gotten hold of HOA stationery and decided to play a joke. But no. The more I read, the colder my stomach became. This wasn't a fine. This wasn't a warning. This was a death sentence for my house. The letter stated, in painfully official language, that the HOA board had voted my property structurally non-compliant and a threat to long-term neighborhood aesthetics. They weren't just asking me to repaint, replace, or repair. They were scheduling demolition. Bulldozers, excavators, gone. My porch swing, my oak tree in my home, all of it, turned into rubble. I sat down on that very swing with the letter in my hands, reading it over and over. I wanted to laugh again, to brush it off as absurd. But the more I stared at those words, the more real it felt. Demolition scheduled in 30 days unless corrective action is taken. Corrective action? What did that even mean? Tear down my porch and rebuild it in fake vinyl siding? Chop down my 100-year-old oak tree so the lawns look more symmetrical? Completely remodel my house just so it fit into their dull little cookie-cutter neighborhood? I could feel the anger rising in my chest. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about property value. This was about control. The HOA wanted conformity, and my house was a reminder that not everything could be controlled, painted beige, and wrapped in regulations. I remember pacing my yard, clutching that letter, my neighbors glancing at me nervously as they walked by. Some of them gave sympathetic looks, like they felt bad for me, but were too afraid to say anything. Others avoided eye contact completely, probably thinking, better him than me. The worst part, deep down, I could tell the HOA thought they had already won. They assumed I'd be too scared, too overwhelmed, too beaten down to fight back, that I'd just give in, bulldoze my own house, and disappear quietly from the neighborhood. But standing there in my yard, with the oak tree towering above me and the porch swing creaking in the wind, I made a promise to myself. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. And this time, I wasn't backing down. The moment I read that demolition notice, my hands were shaking with anger. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the HOA office, demanding an explanation. The line rang twice before someone picked up. A woman's voice answered, cold and professional, like she had been expecting my call all along. HOA office, this is Ms. Peterson. How may I help you? How may you help me? I shot back. You can start by explaining why the hell I just got a notice saying you're planning to demolish my house. There was a pause, followed by the sound of paper shuffling, but her tone didn't waver. In fact, she almost sounded smug, like she had rehearsed the answer. Sir, she said calmly, the board has determined that your property does not meet our long-term community standards. After review, demolition has been scheduled in 30 days unless corrective action is taken. I couldn't believe my ears. Corrective action? What corrective action? My house is perfectly fine. Corrective action, she repeated, means bringing your property into full compliance. That would involve substantial modifications to your home's exterior, landscaping, and overall structure. I realized then what she was really saying. They expected me to rebuild my entire house, at my own expense, just so it matched their bland vision of uniformity. Are you serious? I asked, my voice rising. You're telling me to tear apart my perfectly good home just to fit your rules? Her tone never changed. Sir, you have 30 days to comply. If you refuse, the board has already voted on demolition. I hung up the phone before I said something I'd regret. My blood was boiling. That's when the harassment began. It started small. I come home after work to find yellow violation slips taped to my front door. At first, it was almost laughable. One notice said my grass was too tall. Too tall. I had literally mowed it the night before. I even went outside with a tape measure. It was 2.5 inches, the exact length approved in the HOA handbook. Another notice claimed my porch swing was unsafe. Unsafe. That swing had been there for decades. It was sturdy, secure, and I used it almost every evening without issue. They didn't care. According to them, it was a liability. Then came the letter about my oak tree. They declared it a hazard, claiming it could fall and damage nearby homes. That oak tree had been standing longer than the entire neighborhood. Its roots were deep, its trunk strong. The only hazard it posed was to the HOA's obsession with control. It became a routine. Every time I came home, I half expected to see another notice waiting for me. Trash can left at the curb for too long, violation. Garden hose visible from the street, violation. Car parked facing the wrong way, violation. The fines stacked up fast. $50 here, $75 there. It was like they had a personal vendetta against me. And maybe they did. Neighbors started noticing, too. Some gave me sympathetic looks, whispering things like, "They're really coming after you, huh?" Others avoided me completely, afraid that if they were seen talking to me, they'd become the next target. It was isolation by design. The HOA wanted to break me down, not just financially, but mentally. There were nights I sat on that porch swing with the stack of violation notices in my lap, staring at the oak tree under the glow of the streetlight. Part of me wondered if it would be easier to just give in, to sell the house, pack up, and leave the nightmare behind. But every time I thought about that, I felt a fire light up inside me. This was my home. I had worked years to buy it. I had poured my sweat into fixing it up, turning it into something unique, something alive. And now, a group of self-important board members, with clipboards and power trips, wanted to erase all of it? Not a chance. I started documenting everything. Every violation slip, every fine, every phone call. I took pictures of my lawn after mowing it. I measured the height of my grass and saved the numbers. I recorded conversations with board members when they came onto my property. If they wanted a war, I was ready to give them one. But what struck me most during those weeks wasn't the pettiness of their complaints. It was the smugness, the absolute confidence they had that I would cave. When Ms. Peterson spoke to me on the phone, it wasn't just business. It was arrogance. She spoke like the verdict had already been decided, like I was just another piece on their chessboard they could sweep off at will. That's when it clicked. They didn't just want my porch swing gone. They didn't just want my oak tree cut down. They wanted me gone. They wanted to erase my house, my history, and me along with it, so their perfect little neighborhood could stay flawless in their eyes. But here's what they didn't know. I wasn't the type of person you could push around. I wasn't someone who would quietly disappear because a board told me to. They thought they were dealing with just another homeowner. But what they were really dealing with was someone who knew how to fight back, someone who wasn't afraid to stand alone against their bullying. And I was about to prove to them that their power wasn't as untouchable as they believed. At first, I'll admit, I thought about moving. There were nights when I sat on my porch swing with my head in my hands, staring at that oak tree, wondering if maybe the easiest thing to do was just walk away, sell the house, escape the nightmare, start over somewhere new where people actually minded their own business. The idea of leaving had a certain appeal. I imagined the relief of not finding violation slips taped to my door. No more phone calls from smug HOA board members. No more battles over grass length, porch swings, or the color of my shutters. Just peace and quiet in a place where I could breathe again. But every time I seriously considered it, something in me resisted. This was my home. I had worked too hard for it. Every nail, every repair, every coat of paint. I had poured myself into this place. It wasn't just a house. It was a piece of my life. Why should I be the one to run? Why should I lose everything just because a handful of power-hungry board members thought they could play dictator? And then I remembered something, a small detail tucked away in the back of my mind. Years ago, when I first bought this property, I had gone through the paperwork very carefully. I wasn't like some people who signed on the dotted line without reading. No, I had combed through every clause, every page of the deed, every line of fine print. I remembered noticing something interesting back then, though I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Unlike my neighbors, my house wasn't technically part of the HOA. Why? Because my home was older, built before the HOA even existed. That meant when the HOA was formed and the neighborhood became official, my property wasn't automatically included. And here's the thing. I had never signed anything to join them. No agreement. No membership. Nothing. Which meant one very important truth. They had no legal claim over me. None. No fines. No rules. No demolition orders. Everything they had done, every notice, every violation, every threat, was completely illegal. I sat there in stunned silence as the realization sank in. For weeks, I had been panicking, stressing, and preparing for war with these people, thinking they had all the power. But the truth was, their power over me was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. They had been bluffing. All those smug voices, all those letters with official stamps and bold red letters, all those fines, they were just intimidation tactics. They had been banking on me not knowing my rights. They thought I'd be too scared to question them, too beaten down to push back. But now I knew the truth. And once you know the truth, everything changes. It was like a switch flipped in my head. One moment, I was the underdog, cornered and outnumbered. The next, I realized I was holding all the cards. I pulled out my old deed and property records that night. I spread the papers across my kitchen table and went through them line by line, highlighting everything that proved my property was exempt. Every clause that confirmed my house had been grandfathered in before the HOA came into existence. Every sentence that showed I had never agreed to their terms. The more I read, the more confident I became. I almost laughed out loud. For weeks, they had been threatening to bulldoze my home, and all the while, they had zero authority to touch it. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the stack of papers, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. Game over. The fear that had been gnawing at me vanished. The anxiety that kept me awake at night dissolved. All that was left was determination and a little bit of excitement, because now, it wasn't just about defending my home. It was about turning the tables. All their threats? Useless. All their fines? Worthless. All their smug confidence? About to come crashing down. They thought they were wolves, circling me, ready to take me down. But in reality, they were house cats pretending to be lions, and I had just caught them in the act. I knew what had to be done. I wasn't just going to wave these papers in their faces and demand they leave me alone. No, they had harassed me, bullied me, and tried to steal the home I worked for. They needed to pay for that. They needed to learn that they couldn't abuse their power and get away with it. I sat there, my oak tree swaying outside the window, my porch swing creaking softly in the wind, and I felt a fire burn inside me. Everything they had done was illegal. Every violation, every fine, every demolition threat, it was all a fraud. And now that I knew this, it was no longer a question of whether I'd fight back. It was a matter of how hard I was going to hit. The HOA had declared war on me. But what they didn't realize was this: the war was already over. Because now, I held the one thing they couldn't fight against, the law. And armed with that truth, I was ready to strike. I knew I couldn't face the HOA alone. They had money, influence, and a board that loved throwing their weight around like schoolyard bullies. But this wasn't my first time standing up to unfairness, and I wasn't about to roll over now. So I contacted a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one who specialized in property law. Someone who had dealt with HOAs before and knew exactly how they operated. When I explained my situation, he leaned back in his chair, let out a low whistle, and said, "Oh, I've seen this before. They think they're untouchable. They're not. Not even close." That was the moment I realized I wasn't crazy for fighting back. We started slow, gathering evidence. I had saved every single violation notice, every fine, every threat-filled letter they had ever sent me. Some were neatly filed away, others stuffed into an old shoebox I kept in the closet. My lawyer and I spread them out across his office desk until it looked like a paper battlefield. Months of intimidation in black and white. He flipped through them one by one, chuckling now and then. Charging you $200 for having your trash can visible? That's not enforceable. Claiming your porch swing is unsafe? That's nonsense. And this one, notice of demolition? Completely illegal. With every page he turned, my confidence grew. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't exaggerating. These people really had gone too far. So we filed a lawsuit, and we didn't go small. We hit them with everything we could. Harassment, attempted property seizure, fraud, intimidation, abuse of power. The complaint was over 50 pages long, stuffed with exhibits, photographs, and signed affidavits. When it was officially served, it was like a thunderstorm rolling straight into the heart of their pristine little office. And oh, the panic it caused. The same board members who used to strut around the neighborhood with clipboards now walked with their shoulders slumped, heads down. I saw them avoiding neighbors, whispering in driveways, holding emergency meetings that lasted late into the night. The smug woman from the office, the one who used to call me, voice dripping with fake politeness as she handed out threats, suddenly stopped answering the phone altogether. It was like watching a wolf pack realize they'd just stumbled into a bear's den. But here's the thing, I wasn't done. Because in the middle of all this chaos, while we were combing through zoning maps, property deeds, and old paperwork, my lawyer stumbled on something interesting. Remember that oak tree the HOA had fought so hard to make me cut down? The one they swore was a safety hazard and not in line with community standards. That oak tree stood right at the edge of my property line, and when my lawyer compared the tree's location to the official zoning maps, he noticed something peculiar. The HOA's office, their pride and joy, the headquarters of power, wasn't actually built where it was supposed to be. Part of it sat on land that didn't belong to them. It belonged to the city. At first, I didn't believe him. I mean, how could they make such a massive mistake? But he showed me the maps, the old city records, and the surveys. And there it was in black and white. The HOA office was partially squatting on property they had no legal claim to. The irony was delicious. Here they were, trying to bulldoze my perfectly legal home, all while their own office was nothing more than a glorified trespasser. So we filed a complaint with the city. Just one simple complaint with all the evidence attached. The response was faster than I expected. Within a week, city inspectors showed up at the HOA office. Neighbors watched from their porches as men in suits with clipboards walked around the building, taking photos, measuring distances, pointing at survey markers. The board members tried to argue, tried to wave their hands and talk their way out of it, but it was no use. The truth was too clear. The HOA office was in violation of zoning laws, and once that determination was made, the process moved quickly. First came the warning notice, then the condemnation order, and finally, the demolition order. I will never forget the day it happened. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the air feels heavy with anticipation. I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling down the street. When I stepped outside, coffee in hand, I saw the bulldozers parked in front of the HOA office. Workers in hard hats were stringing up caution tape, while a crowd of neighbors began to gather. Some looked shocked. Others whispered excitedly. A few were grinning ear to ear, barely able to hide their satisfaction. The board members stood off to the side, red-faced and helpless. For once, they were the ones with no power, no authority, no control. The demolition crew wasted no time. The first swing of the excavator's arm smashed through a window, glass shattering like the illusion of power the HOA had tried to hold over us. With every crash, every rumble, every groan of metal and wood collapsing, it felt like justice was finally being served. Neighbors cheered. Some clapped. Others just watched in stunned silence as the once feared headquarters of the HOA was reduced to rubble. And me? I just stood there, arms crossed, a smile creeping across my face. They had tried to bulldoze my house. They had sent me letters, fines, threats, and demolition notices. They thought they could scare me into submission. They thought they could erase me. But in the end, it was their office, their so-called fortress of control, that was bulldozed into dust. The irony was so perfect, it felt like something out of a movie. By the afternoon, the lot was empty. All that remained was a flattened patch of dirt and a few piles of debris waiting to be hauled away. The yellow tape still flapped in the breeze, a reminder of the empire that had just crumbled. Neighbors came up to me that day, patting me on the back, whispering words of thanks. Some laughed, others simply shook their heads in disbelief. One man muttered, "I never thought I'd see the day." But I had seen it. I had fought for it, and I had won. As I walked back to my house, past the oak tree they had once tried to condemn, I couldn't help but feel the weight of poetic justice. They tried to bulldoze my house, but in the end, it was their office that got bulldozed into dust. And I didn't even have to lift a finger. From that day forward, everything in the neighborhood changed. The HOA lost its grip completely. With no office, no funds, and no legitimacy, their power vanished overnight. Board members resigned one by one, too embarrassed to show their faces in public. The lawsuits drained whatever fight they had left. But me? I stayed right where I was, on my porch swing, under the shade of that mighty oak tree. And every time I heard the creak of the swing or the rustle of the leaves, I was reminded of one simple truth. Bullies only win if you let them. When the dust cleared, literally, the neighborhood wasn't the same anymore. The roar of bulldozers, the crash of concrete, and the hiss of machinery tearing down the HOA office had left behind more than just an empty lot. It had left behind silence. A silence so heavy, so unfamiliar, that for the first time in years people weren't listening for the next threat or the next knock on the door. The headquarters of fear was gone, And with it, the so-called authority of the HOA crumbled overnight. Without their office, they had no meeting space, no central command where they could gather in their little echo chamber and dream up new rules. The lawsuit drained their funds dry, and soon even the most loyal board members couldn't stand the shame and pressure anymore. They resigned one by one, until the HOA was nothing more than a memory. For a while, people didn't quite know how to react. Imagine living under rules for so long that you don't even realize how much freedom you've lost. That's what it was like. Neighbors would still pull their trash cans in immediately after pickup, almost out of muscle memory. Parents would remind kids to park their bikes neatly, only to pause mid-sentence, laugh, and shake their heads as they realized there was no one left to find them anymore. And then, slowly, something incredible started to happen. One by one, houses began to change. The first act of rebellion came from Mrs. Hernandez, the sweet old lady down the street, who had always dreamed of painting her house bright yellow. For years she had kept it approved beige, to avoid fines. But the morning after the demolition, she marched right out with 2 buckets of paint and a wide brush. By sunset, her home shone like a ray of sunshine against the backdrop of cookie-cutter houses. Some neighbors whispered, worried that she'd get in trouble. Others just stood in awe. And when no violation notice came the next morning, the fear began to melt away. Next came the Thompsons. They'd always wanted a vegetable garden in their front yard, but the HOA had deemed non-landscaping plants as unacceptable. Within a week of the office being bulldozed, they dug up the front lawn and replaced it with rows of tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers. Neighbors stopped to chat with them while walking their dogs, asking for gardening tips. Children who had never tasted a tomato straight from the vine got their first taste, and swore it was the best tomato they'd ever eaten. Then came the Henderson family. Their kids had been begging for a treehouse for years, but the HOA rules banned unsightly additions. With the board gone, Mr. Henderson bought lumber and spent 2 weekends building a massive wooden treehouse in the oak tree in their backyard. By the 3rd weekend, it wasn't just his kids climbing up the ladder. Half the neighborhood kids were hanging out up there, laughing and shouting, their joy echoing through the streets. And the most beautiful part? Nobody was afraid anymore. The same people who once kept their blinds shut tight now started sitting on porches, waving at passing neighbors. Families had cookouts without worrying if the smoke from their grill would spark a warning letter. Kids left bikes on the lawn, scooters in driveways, chalk drawings on sidewalks, and instead of panicking, parents smiled, relieved that childhood could finally be messy and free again. The neighborhood began to feel alive. It wasn't just about paint colors and lawns anymore. It was about spirit. People started talking to each other in ways they hadn't in years. They shared tools, swapped recipes, and told stories about how the HOA had once humiliated or fined them. And with every story, with every laugh about the old days, you could feel the weight lifting off their shoulders. For so long, people had been tricked into thinking the HOA protected them, but all it ever did was suffocate them. And once that illusion was broken, once the office came crashing down, everyone realized how foolish it had been to live in fear of a handful of bullies with clipboards. And as for me, I stayed right where I was, on my porch swing, under that oak tree they once called a hazard. I rocked back and forth, listening to the creak of the chains, the rustle of leaves above, and the distant sound of children laughing somewhere down the block. I had fought to keep this house. They said it dragged down property values, that it didn't match the neighborhood. But now, people walked past and smiled at my porch swing, waved at me, even sat down to talk. My home had gone from being the so-called problem to being a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the thing that stands out is the thing that saves everyone else. One evening, Mr. Thomas, the neighbor who had always kept to himself, stopped by. He carried a beer in his hand and said, "Mind if I join you?" We sat on that porch for hours, talking about everything from family to fishing. At one point he said, "You know, I never thought we could beat them. I figured the HOA was just part of life, like taxes or traffic. But you proved they could be stopped." It hit me then. This fight wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone in the neighborhood. Every parent who had been too scared to let their kids play outside. Every homeowner who had been humiliated for having the wrong flowers. Every family who had been forced to bend to the will of a board that pretended to care about standards. I hadn't just saved my house. I had helped save an entire community. And what I learned through it all is simple but powerful. Bullies only win when people stay silent. The HOA thrived on intimidation. They sent letters in bold red ink, hoping fear would do the work for them. They handed out fines, not because they cared about property values, but because they loved the power it gave them. And for years it worked. But the second someone stood up, their empire crumbled. Because at the core, it was never strong. It was hollow. That's the lesson I hope my story carries. You don't have to accept unfairness just because it's common. You don't have to bow to authority just because they claim to have it. If you know you're right, if you know the truth, then stand firm. Even if your voice shakes, even if you're alone at first. Because once you shine a light on injustice, it doesn't just help you. It frees everyone else trapped in the dark. The day the HOA office was bulldozed wasn't just about tearing down a building. It was about tearing down years of fear. It was about showing an entire neighborhood that they had been stronger all along. They just didn't know it yet. Now, when I sit on my porch swing under that oak tree, I don't just see houses. I see homes. I see porches painted in colors people actually like. I see kids playing freely. I see neighbors who finally look relaxed, happy, and proud of where they live. That's the true victory. Not the lawsuit. Not the demolition. Not even the fines I'll never have to pay again. The victory is in the freedom. The victory is in watching people reclaim their joy, their individuality, their community. The victory is knowing that one act of resistance, one refusal to bow down, was enough to bring the whole crooked system crashing down. And every time I think about it, every time I hear the creak of that porch swing, I smile. Because in the end, the HOA didn't just lose their office. They lost their grip on us. And we got our lives back. So what's the lesson here? It's simple, really, but it's also one of the hardest truths to live by. Don't let people in power scare you into silence. The HOA thought they had all the power. They had their rules typed up in fancy binders, their warning letters stamped in red ink, their fines printed with legal-sounding jargon. They walked around with clipboards like soldiers on patrol, pointing out every blade of grass that wasn't cut to regulation height. To them, authority was a weapon, and they assumed that if they looked official enough, spoke sternly enough, and threatened often enough, people would fold. And for years, they were right. People caved under the pressure. They paid fines, even when the fines made no sense. They tore down porches they had built with their own hands. They painted over murals their children had drawn. They trimmed trees that had stood longer than any of the board members themselves. Why? Not because they wanted to, but because they were afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of retaliation. Afraid that maybe, just maybe, the HOA really did have the power to erase them. That's how bullies work. Bullies don't need to be right. They just need you to believe they're unstoppable. But here's the truth. No one is unstoppable. No system, no person, no board is so powerful that it can't be challenged. The only way fear works is if you let it take root inside you. That was the trap they wanted me to fall into. They wanted me to believe that my house, my home, could be erased with a single order. They wanted me to doubt myself, to second-guess my rights, to think, maybe they really can bulldoze it. Maybe I should just give in. But I didn't. Instead, I stood my ground. I learned my rights. I sought help. I gathered every letter, every fine, every scrap of so-called evidence they tried to use against me, and I turned it back on them. And when the time came, I didn't back down. That's all it really took. Not an army. Not millions of dollars. Not some magical loophole. Just persistence. Just courage. Just the willingness to say, no, you're wrong, and I won't be afraid of you anymore. And look at what happened. In the end, their empire crumbled. Not because I was stronger, but because they were weaker than they wanted anyone to believe. They built their authority on lies, on zoning violations, on intimidation, on paperwork designed to confuse rather than protect. And when those lies were exposed, the whole thing collapsed like a house of cards. That's the lesson I want you to take with you. When someone tries to bully you, push you, or threaten what's yours, don't give up. Don't hand over your peace, your dignity, or your rights just because someone in a position of power tells you to. Ask questions. Do your research. Fight back if you must. Because power isn't about who yells the loudest or who waves the biggest rulebook. Real power lies in truth, and truth is always stronger than lies. Sometimes people ask me, wasn't it scary? Weren't you afraid of losing everything? Of course I was. Fear doesn't go away just because you're doing the right thing. I had nights where I barely slept, days where my hands shook opening letters from the HOA, moments when I doubted myself. That's normal. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward in spite of it. And when you do, something amazing happens. You realize the people who tried to scare you were never that strong in the first place. Their threats lose their bite. Their intimidation loses its weight. And you, the one they tried to silence, become stronger than you ever imagined. That's what happened to me. They thought the bulldozer would erase me. Instead, it erased them. They thought fines would break me. Instead, the lawsuit broke them. They thought silence would protect their power. But by speaking out, I shattered it. So remember this. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just surviving, it's thriving. It's standing tall while watching those who try to tear you down lose everything they once held over you. It's knowing that the very tactics they used to crush you ended up destroying them. And it's not just about HOAs. This lesson applies everywhere. Whether it's a boss who abuses their power, a system that tries to rob you of your rights, or a person in your life who thrives on fear. Don't let them win by staying quiet. Stand up. Push back. Speak truth. Because even if your voice shakes, even if you feel like you're standing alone, you'll be stronger than they are in the end. The HOA thought they could intimidate me into silence. But the louder they yelled, the clearer I saw. Their power only existed because people gave it to them. When I stopped giving in, when I stopped being afraid, their empire vanished. And that's the final lesson I want you to remember. Fear only works when you accept it. Power only works when you hand it over. The second you stop, the second you fight back, bullies lose everything. Because at the end of the day, the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's freedom. And trust me, there's no sweeter victory than sitting under your own oak tree, on your own porch swing, in your own home smiling, because the people who try to take it from you are gone, and you're still standing.